All right. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday with the Dickens Society. My name is Mads Golding. I'm the chair of the Dickens Society Communications Committee, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this virtual conference on Dickens and Death. I'd like to extend my thanks to the officers at the Dickens Society, particularly Dr. Chris Louttit, for his and their trust in this project. And special thanks, of course, are due to my colleagues at the Dickens Society who join us today as well. Thanks to Doctors Lydia Craig, Céleste Callen, and Katie Bell for their enthusiasm, support, and patience with this endeavor. It really does take a village to plan a virtual wake. This event was born out of a desire to offer a virtual, free, accessible conference space to celebrate Dickens' legacy as the Dickens Society navigates the shifting tide of modern academic discourse. We're thrilled to be joined today by two presenters from the US. I understand that one of our contributors, Dean Hill from the University of Birmingham, will not be available for the Q&A afterwards, but we will still watch his video. He's available for questions via email, which will be available in the YouTube comment section on the Society's YouTube channel. We are joined live today by Dr. Scott Caddy and Spencer Todd. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. Now, a brief note on the format of this event. 3 people have entered the waiting room. I'm going to let them in. And there we are. Joining. Lovely. All right. A brief note on the format of this event. The presentations were sent in by our speakers, and they'll be played with a note to introduce each presentation. We'll watch the videos and then have a Q&A afterwards. The Q&A will not be recorded, so feel free to ask questions comfortably. The presentation part of this is of course being recorded. No, that's an edit we'll leave there. All right, one final note before we begin. Just a reminder that the annual Dickens Society Symposium will be live at Boston University from the 14th to the 17th of July, 2025. Registration for the conference is, I believe, still open. And that those links and that information will also be in the YouTube section for you to peruse later. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first presentation. This is, we have Charles Dickens and His Long Afterlife by Dr. Scott Caddy. Dr. Scott Caddy is a Marion L. Britton postdoctoral fellow at Georgia Tech, where he teaches multimedia composition classes themed around literary adaptations, digital rhetoric and activism, and cultural outliers and outlaws. He is also the assistant editor of the Dickens Letters Project and runs their social media accounts. Dr. Caddy has experience teaching digital humanities for these summer sessions through the University of California, Berkeley, and has published scholarship on web adaptations of Jane Austen, The Professor by Charlotte Bronte, and has forthcoming work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood as data for the Dickensian. Without further ado, here comes his video.
The Georgia Institute of Technology and the assistant editor of the Dickens Letters Project. I am so excited to talk as part of the Dickens Death Day event as organized by the Dickens Society. And today I want to focus on what I think is the unique phenomenon regarding Dickens and death, his afterlife. In March of 2023, John Mullen wrote about the persistent nature of Dickens' work through many adaptations for The Guardian. What is of particular note is not exactly what Mullen argued, that Dickens' humor and understanding of the human condition makes his work eminently adaptable, for many audiences across many mediums. Rather, I want to focus on the title here, Adapt and Survive, two present tense verbs used to describe the activity of adapting Charles Dickens' works to the screen and the stage, but also providing an implication that Dickens himself is somehow alive and well today through his works, like an organism evolving to fit its environment or surviving harsh conditions. Mullen's verbiage here suggests that something is keeping Dickens alive. So who or what exactly is prolonging the afterlife of Charles Dickens? I want to place special focus on Dickens' afterlife for two reasons. One, I believe the unique circumstances of his death, overlapping with the publication of his unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, created a cultural anxiety over an ending that does not exist. The end of Charles Dickens' life is paired with the lack of an ending for Edwin Drood, inviting audiences to surmise an ending that aligns with Charles Dickens' possible intentions for their own imagined conclusions, but also inviting us to revisit all of his works, his life, and his afterlife as a perpetual contemporary event, one that we, including myself, other video panelists, and the audience, are aiding in its continual fruition. Secondly, there's also been a robust global network of dedicated readers and scholars throughout Dickens' career and after his death that have preserved his legacy for contemporary audiences through artifacts like adaptations, official museums, societies, and journals dedicated to the scholarly work on his life and writing. These organizations and publications continue a traditional legacy of historical record, research, and preservation that align with the theme of this event. But this is not to say that his long afterlife is a negative result, that we should have let Charles Dickens' death be the end of any reading or study. Dickens was too large of a public figure to ignore, but the nature of Edwin Drood, that is unfinished, left an opportunity for an afterlife unlike any other we have seen, save for perhaps the large followings of fellow British authors like William Shakespeare and Jane Austen. I want to start by recounting briefly and generally the reaction to Edwin Drood's unfinished nature overlapping with Charles Dickens' death. The attempts to finish this novel aim for a neat closure that mirrors the finite end of the author's life. In other words, we have an unfinished novel and a finished life. Two particular finishes or attempted endings of the novel that I want to highlight are John Jasper's Secret from 1871 by Henry Morford and Edwin Drood Part II, often called The Complete Edwin Drood, in 1873 by Thomas James. Henry Morford continued the supposed end that Dickens had articulated, with Jasper as the murderer of Edwin, getting all the way down to the recounting of his murder of Edwin and being put in prison. Now, Edwin Drood Part II is a little different, and I think gets to this whole idea of afterlife as well, where Thomas James claims to have been given the finish by Dickens' spirit via a medium. This plays into the whole idea of afterlife, this whole idea that Dickens did not rest, brings it into kind of a cultural mythology. And another example of these attempts to this idea that there needed to be closure with Edwin Drood comes from the Dickens Fellowship in 1914, where they held a trial of John Jasper for the murder of Edwin Drood. Famous playwright George Bernard Shaw played the rather frivolous chairman of the jury, and Shaw turned up despite declining the invitation at first. The verdict, by the way, was guilty. Now, I made mention of the Dickens Fellowship here as it also holds a special place in the study of Dickens and the afterlife, which I argue is the event that we are here for today. These are examples of digital artifacts, scholarship, and societies that I think are helping prolong this afterlife. And again, I don't mean that with any negative connotation, but that this work is continuing the life of Dickens, per se. We have the Dickens Letters Project, which archives and presents his personal letters as they're discovered and verified, both in a plain text format and through some universities and scholarships, the actual images of the letters, some of which are on the website for the Dickens Museum. We have the Dickensian Journal, which is also part of the Dickens Fellowship, and the Dickens Quarterly, both publications dedicated to scholarship on Dickens' work, his life writing, reviews of monographs of Dickens scholarship, and also reviews of Dickensian media and adaptations. In regards to the Dickens Letters Project, though, Lydia Craig, in the Dickens Quarterly, mentions that the significance of these letters for study of Dickens and the understanding of his life as such. Judicious use of editorial interventions elucidates the general meaning of each letter. The Charles Dickens Letters Project constitutes a valuable digital resource for studying Dickens and the times in which he lived. Now, this review stresses the past tense here, in which he lived, but the archiving of and access to letters continues to grow, with web supplements 17 and 18 published this year, dozens of new letters by Dickens discovered and shared with the public. As an assistant editor of the project, I also have the pleasure of sharing these letters via X or Twitter with the hashtag OTD or hashtag on this day tag that invites readers to see what Charles Dickens wrote or experienced on given days. I interact frequently with the following organizations on X, Instagram, and Facebook, all of whom are dedicated to preserving the study and life of Dickens, making his work seem contemporaneous through social media posts, and, in the case of the Dickens Society today, and the Dickens Project, which runs the Dickens Universe at UC Santa Cruz, creating events that continue to memorialize, analyze, and reinterpret Dickens and his works. In the case of Dickens You Say, which is a social media account on X and now Blue Sky, they publish excerpts from his writing that are then retweeted and reposted by others, sort of, proliferating Dickens' work again throughout social media as if it were contemporary and new. And the Charles Dickens Museum, which also is in partnership with the Dickens Fellowship, provides some commentary and context on artifacts that are housed in the museum, including, in some case, letters. But speaking of interpretations, reinterpretations, adaptations of Charles Dickens' work, and perpetuating this afterlife, this is where I'd like to come full circle to Mullen's Guardian article about adapting and surviving. A list I found on IMDb named 87 adaptations of Dickens' work, including biopics and, quote, interpretations of Dickens's life, though it is not an exhaustive list of every adaptation in every medium, as it is missing some stage adaptations and other forms of media outside of television and film. While I cannot elucidate on all 87 of those adaptations in that list, I want to make note of 3 adaptations that are involved with this reinterpretation and repurposing of Charles Dickens' work for new audiences. There is, of course, the famous Muppets Christmas Carol from 1992, which takes a comedic, family-friendly approach to Dickens' classic Christmas story to make it more of a 20th century episode of The Muppet Show, even with some period dress and settings for the most part. Seeing Dickens represented by Gonzo is uncanny and humorous, but also sobering in terms of Charles Dickens' death. Now he can be represented in radically different ways, while the nature of his work is still largely accessible and meaningful for new audiences, and being represented in a different culturally relevant character that the audience can latch on to. The same can be said for the 2017 film The Man Who Invented Christmas, which imagines the creative process and personal life of Dickens while he penned his most famous tale, arguably. Audiences today would not be privy to this process, so a film like this guides them into Dickens' life as both an object of study and a present living person through an immersive cinematic retelling. Lastly, I have an image here from 2019's The Personal History of David Copperfield, which A24 had also billed as a modern retelling of the story, though, as we can see here, the dress and setting are still signaling a faithful or somewhat faithful period piece. Dev Patel's casting as the title character reflects the evolving global nature of Dickens's reach and understanding across cultures, where an Indian actor can comfortably take on the role of a character that might otherwise be a traditional white character in past adaptations and interpretations of the text. This is an active adaptation both cinematically and environmentally, returning to Mullen's claim, the survival to which Mullen alluded to and that we perpetuate today. By changing the casting to reflect more of the global audience, the personal history of David Copperfield is an artifact of the adapting, surviving, and perpetuation of Dickens' work, life, and afterlife that we are able to enjoy today. In short, I want to reiterate that when we discuss Dickens and his death, we are basking in an afterlife that we have created. This perpetuated study comes in the form of digital artifacts, societies, adaptations, and scholarship. His afterlife, Charles Dickens' afterlife, exists and persists because of our activity, and will continue so long as we sustain it. It's the adapting and surviving that Mullen talked about is actually being done by us, the readers, the audience, the lovers of Charles Dickens. I thank you for your time today. Here is my contact information if you're interested in connecting beyond this video and the Dickens Death Day event. It has been a pleasure partaking in the prolonged afterlife of Charles Dickens with all of you.
Marvelous. Dr. Caddy, thank you so much for that contribution. All right. Up next. Up next, we have Spencer Dodd. Spencer Dodd is a PhD candidate in English at the Louisiana State University. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in Global 19th Century Studies, Dickens Studies Annual, New Delta Review, and elsewhere. And this is The Death of Steerforth.
The death of James Steerforth is the final cataclysm of David Copperfield and the catalyst of one of the most heart-wrenching Dickensian scenes of mourning. The compound tragedy of the scene is cemented by Ham's death and his valiant but in vain rescue efforts, and by the subsequent revelation of Steerforth's seduction of Rosa Dartle in what the narrator calls, quote, the irremediable past. The death of David Copperfield's first friend is a painful aporia within the novel due to David's struggle to square Steerforth's self-interested betrayals with his formative mentorship. Critics have long read Steerforth's life and death as a comment on the demise of the romantic aesthetics and politics of the previous generation, personified through the tragic, callous, Byronic hero. But beyond his Byronic characterization, Steerforth exemplifies the larger trend within Dickens's work to nostalgically valorize the departed masculinities of previous generations for their power and eccentricity, as reflected in other Dickensian figures like Fezziwig or Mr. Turveydrop. This talk will explore how Dickens expresses a larger sense of historical and generational loss through Steerforth's death. First, I'll present a reading of the death scene centered thematically around the unattainable almost it presents as the novel's last dividing line between past and present. Next, I'll ground this analysis in David's long relationship with Steerforth, which begins with representations of archaic patronage that the novel carries until the end. Lastly, this talk will end with a comparison to other characters who broadly illustrate Dickens's nostalgic appreciation for the English past, especially the long 18th century. Steerforth's death anchors the last tragic arc of Dickens's most directly autobiographical novel. David introduces it as quote, an event so indelible, so awful, so bound by an infinite variety of ties to all that has preceded it, end quote, as to extend its shadow retroactively over the narrator's childhood and into the present. Indeed, we see the storm that will swallow Steerforth, Ham, and so many others foreshadowed in the night sky as David departs the Steerforth manor for the penultimate time. Mrs. Steerforth and Rosa Dartle look out the valley below where, quote, a mist was rising like a sea, which, mingling with the darkness, made it seem as if the gathering waters would encompass them. Before I looked upon those two again, a stormy sea had risen to their feet, end quote. This once-in-a-generation storm is monumental in its size and fury. For miles inland, quote, every sheet and puddle lashed its banks, end quote, while, quote, the waves on the horizon, caught at intervals above the rolling abyss, were like glimpses of another shore with towers and buildings, end quote. So great is the coming calamity that will sweep Steerforth and so many others aside that it seemingly provides a merest glimpse of the fallen world to come. David is sure that, quote, the tremendous sea itself, end quote, and its high watery walls will, quote, undermine the earth, end quote, by washing away the roots of human life. The schooner, laden with fruits and wine, carrying Steerforth home from Iberia, arrived several days into this cataclysmic storm, going down on a nearby beach. David rushes to the scene through a storm that rages like the sound of a deafening cannonade, as if it's a great battle. The war with the wild sea has been hopelessly lost, and our last glimpse of Steerforth alive is, quote, the active figure with the curling hair, end quote, clings to the ship's last mast as it tantalizingly resurfaces. Steerforth waves goodbye with a singular red cap, though David still hasn't completely recognized him. But it's clear that this is the last chance, and Ham wades into the churning water, quote, rising with the hills, falling with the valleys, lost beneath the rugged foam, borne in towards the shore, borne on towards the ship, striving hard and valiantly. The distance was nothing, but the power of the sea and wind made the strife deadly, end quote. One stride away from salvation, Ham, Steerforth, and the entire wreck are annihilated by a quote, high, green, vast hillside of water, end quote, which Ham seemed to leap up and into, quote, with a mighty bound, end quote, and then all is lost, save insignificant fragments of wood in the water, quote, as if a mere cask had been broken, end quote. Ham's body, crushed by the wave, is recovered relatively quickly, but Steerforth washes up later, near where the Peggotty cottage once stood, and David says, quote, among the ruins of the home he had wronged, I saw him lying with his head upon his arm, as I had often seen him lie at school, end quote. So ends James Steerforth, the only villain of David Copperfield, as John Gordon notes, quote, not quote, to face fatal punishment for his transgressions, but also the only one to be exalted by the narrator despite it all. Though Steerforth's death, or through Steerforth's death, Dickens's narrator mourns an ill-fated, anachronistic, adventurous masculinity, despite his faults and excesses. And now, some more about what Steerforth means to the narrator. The novel's first line, quote, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show, end quote, famously leaves David's protagonism an open question, but the last clause of the sentence is less equivocal. The textual record, for all its imperfections and omissions, should show true and preserve what has been lost. The loss of Steerforth weighs heavily upon David's psyche to the point that he remains the narrator's hero in the classical and Byronic senses. Heroism to David denotes a spectacular progression through life as a series of aesthetic encounters, and fittingly, the narrator never completely moves past his enduring fascination with Steerforth, while David later agrees with Rose's assessment that the absolute freedom granted to Steerforth by his mother and by the world more generally allotted his transgressions. The extent to which David actually condemns him is debatable, for the narrator usually remains silent on the subject. Though he is acutely aware of Steerforth's betrayals, especially his predation of Emily, David retains unpayable debt and unshakable loyalty to his first patron. To him, Steerforth will always posthumously appear in his initial role as ring giver. This role emerges in their first meeting, which marks the end of David's miserable first months at Salem House, where he says, quote, "I was not considered as being formally received into the school," end quote, until Steerforth had taken notice of him, and that every prior interaction he had at Salem House felt like being a prisoner before the magistrate. So in this first meeting, Steerforth convinces David to part with his allowance of 7 shillings, which buys a, quote, "royal spread," end quote, of currant wine and cakes that, with David's encouragement, the older boy dispenses to the group with, quote, "perfect fairness," end quote. This scene is a loyalty ritual initiating David into this schoolboy group and more broadly into Steerforth's service. It's both the first positive experience David has had in a long time and one that'll prove enduringly formative to the narrator's identity and vocation. David's first foray into storytelling is the nightly recitation of his inherited trove of 18th century novels, which includes many of Dickens's favorites, like the picaresque novels of Tobias Smollett. For Steerforth's benefit, they, quote, "make some regular Arabian Nights of it," end quote, and in return, David receives academic help and companionship. He flourishes for the first time here, though the middle-aged narrator is quick to add, quote, "I was moved by no interested or selfish motive, nor was I moved by fear of him. I admired and loved him, and his approval was return enough," end quote. This denial of exchange shows both David's lingering affection and this relationship's aesthetic foundation in quasi-feudal class politics, illustrating a nostalgia for what Elaine Hadley calls the, quote, "deferential culture," end quote, of pre-industrial Britain. At some level, David Copperfield will always be Steerforth's Shahrazad, and the novel consistently presents the doomed, rakish aristocrat, good and bad, in regal terms. We see ample evidence of his caprice and arbitrary exercise of power beyond the main affair of Emily's seduction, including his exile of Mr. Mell and his youthful disfigurement and abandonment of Rosa Dartle. Steerforth consistently treats his inferiors poorly, and the narrator's perspective is warped by David's elegy for his friend and the spectacular, callous, aristocratic masculinity he represented. Most of Dickens's depictions of anachronistic characters rooted in the tropes of the 18th and early 19th centuries do less harm than Steerforth, often being fondly remembered oddities. In 1866, author and editor John Timms published English Eccentrics and Eccentricities, a mostly non-fictional volume recounting the biographies of many of London's weirdest personalities of the previous few generations. Timms's preface describes the object of his volume, quote, "to show that with oddity of character may coexist much goodness of heart," end quote. Dickens, whose work had been in vogue for decades by 1866, explored similar ideas through characters like Fezziwig, Jarvis Lorry, Mr. Turveydrop, Mr. Dick, Betsy Trotwood, and others. His historical novels, Barnaby Rudge and A Tale of Two Cities, and the quirky characters that more broadly inhabit his work, received a fair amount of criticism for various anachronisms and or quintessentially Dickensian character tics, often justifiably, but these aspects of Dickens's work demonstrate a genuine enthusiasm for England's past and its lost personalities. I'll conclude by returning to David Copperfield and our discussion of Steerforth's death through a brief note about the whimsical, childish, and wise artist Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick's labors on his unfinishable memorial are interrupted and interpolated by the ghostly severed head of King Charles I. David's aunt, Betsy Trotwood, Mr. Dick's partner, and herself a relic of 18th century eccentric rationalism, tellingly explicates the phantom head as, quote, his allegorical way of expressing it, he connects his illness with great disturbance and agitation naturally, and that's the figure or the simile or whatever it's called which he chooses to use, and why shouldn't he if he thinks proper, end quote. This endorsement of authorial license frames Mr. Dick as Dickens's third proxy in the novel, rounding out the two David Copperfields. Mr. Dick is an unworldly artist engaging in free association to offset the trauma of his favorite sister's subjugation by her husband, who, quote, made her wretched, end quote, like Steerforth had done to Emily and Rosa, and Mr. Murdstone to Claire and Copperfield. The middle-aged narrator is more industrious and worldly than Mr. Dick, but he too is haunted by his own severed regal head. Steerforth's formative example that clouds his life and labors. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Spencer. Right, and finally, we have Virtual Hauntings, Reviving Dickens's Deaths Through Virtual Reality and Artificial Intelligence by Dean J. Hill from the University of Birmingham. Dean Hill is a postgraduate researcher in the Department of English at the University of Birmingham, specializing in the intersection of George Orwell and artificial intelligence. He was the recipient of the 2024 Robert B. Barlow Jr. Prize from the Dickens Society. He recently presented research at the World Conference on English. Dean is reader for the journal's Harvard Review, published by Houghton Library. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, at Harvard University, and for Exposition Review and Plowshares. Moreover, he has contributed to the Orwell Youth Prize for the last 2 years, and this year he supported longlisting for the Highland Book Prize.
Hello and welcome to this presentation. My name is Dean Hill, and I'm a postgraduate researcher in the Department of English Literature at the University of Birmingham. My presentation is entitled Virtual Hauntings, Reviving Dickensian Deaths Through VR and AI. Now, imagine stepping into a Dickens novel and witnessing its ghosts firsthand. Charles Dickens was famously fascinated by the supernatural, the interspersed but unmistakable presence of ghosts and goblins, the grotesque, the eerie, the uncanny fill his works. Victorians loved ghost stories and spiritualism, and Dickens himself wrote many, from A Christmas Carol's spectral visitors to the lesser-known The Haunted Man. Today, new technologies let us actually experience Dickensian hauntings. Virtual reality, VR, and artificial intelligence, AI, are bringing Dickens's phantoms into interactive life. In these next few minutes, we'll explore how cutting-edge VR performances, apps, and AI dialogues are reinterpreting Dickens's visions of death and the supernatural, and what this means for our own age. So let's begin then with immersive VR theatre, reimagining Dickens. Modern VR productions place audiences inside Dickens's stories. For example, Agile Lens's A Christmas Carol, VR, is a live, real-time immersive theatre adaptation of Dickens's classic, performed entirely in virtual reality. Audiences don headsets like MetaQuest and watch as actors embody Scrooge and the three spirits in a haunted dreamscape of foggy Victorian streets. Agile Lens began collaborating with Actors Theatre of Louisville in 2021, creating a hybrid production and R&D lab called Scrooge's Ghost Encounter. In that lab show, actor Ari Tarr as Scrooge delivered a live Dickensian recital, while mocap technology animated its ghostly surroundings. By 2022 to 23, A Christmas Carol VR had evolved to a fully lived VR performance, Veteran actors Scrooge and the Spirits used advanced motion capture suits, even Sony's new Mocopi tracker, to puppeteer their digital avatars in real time. The effect is uncanny. The system syncs actor and avatar motion in real time, making Scrooge's movements and voice seem inside your virtual world. In short, audiences enter the Dickensian story, exploring cobbled 1840s London streets and interacting with spectral figures. One early participant described Chains, a Victorian nightmare, a related mixed reality Carol adaptation, as a dark and beautiful fever dream, where the viewer can even converse with the ghosts. Other VR adaptations use similar ideas. For example, Actors Theatre's 2021 lab production Scrooge's Ghost Encounter with Agile Lens combined live recitation and VR. It projected a haunted dreamscape filled with phantom spirits and spectres, letting the lone viewer look around and even interact via Oculus Quest. MWM Immersive's Chained, a Victorian Nightmare did something related. One audience member at a time wears a VR headset inside a Victorian set and walks through his own visions of Christmas past, present and future. Reviewers noted that Chained blended live acting and VR into a personalised reimagining of A Christmas Carol, so that you literally feel as if you have walked into 19th century London and into Dickens's book. In these productions, VR technology, headsets, Unreal Engine environments, live motion capture, serves to make Dickens's ghosts and deathly themes vividly real. Moving on to community VR and virtual tours. It's not just professional theatres. Virtual Dickens experiences are spreading to new audiences. For example, the Thrive Pavilion is a 3D social VR community for seniors, and their Thrive Players staged a Christmas Carol adaptation entirely in VR. In December 2024, they performed a 1.5 hour live VR play of A Christmas Carol, where members of the Thrive Pavilion, a vibrant senior community in virtual reality, play characters for a global online audience. The game engine, live avatars and 3D set all immersive participants in the Victorian story, illustrating how accessible VR theatre can engage non-traditional performers and audiences alike. Meanwhile, educators use VR to explore Dickens in schools. Class VR, a VR learning platform, has released interactive Dickens scenes, workhouses, foggy London, etc., from novels like Oliver Twist and Great Expectations. Students can delve deep into those worlds by literally walking around them in VR. By inhabiting Oliver's workhouse or Pip's London, learners gain emotional insight into Dickensian poverty and death in ways a textbook never could. Even standard video calls are used to tour Dickens's London. In 2020 to 21, to mark the 150th anniversary of Dickens's death, historian Richard Jones led a virtual London tour on Zoom. The tour followed Dickens's life through the city, from his impoverished childhood to his adult literary success. Attendees were not confined to any one part of London, thanks to this VR streaming approach. As the brochure explains, technology has come to the rescue, and thanks to the magic of Zoom, the tour will go ahead as a virtual tour, taking people through Dickensian landmarks via HD video. Such virtual tours show how even simple tech can transport us to Dickens's world, blurring past and present. Immersive audio and augmented reality. Another branch of AR and VR technology is audio immersion. The Immersive Dickens project, a collaboration between the V&A Museum, theatre makers Punch Drunk, and creative tech studio The Workers, created what it called augmented reality for your ears. In 2018, they gave museum visitors special headphone guides that suddenly transformed. Instead of a dry tour, the headphones played new soundscapes. As you walked around, you'd hear Charles Dickens whispering in your ear, footsteps nearby, church bells tolling. all as if you had truly stepped into that environment. In short, you heard ghosts and Victorian life as you moved through space. By tracking the listener's location, Immersive Dickens created a 3D sound world. Move left and a voice follows you there. The team even called it an audio tour that gets suddenly hijacked by Charles Dickens himself, leading students into an otherworldly parallel London. This augmented reality for your ears made Dickens's presence vividly real without any visuals at all. Projects like this show how haunting audiences can be as simple as ghostly sound, emphasising how Dickens's written ghosts can speak back to us in unexpected ways. Now, alongside VR, artificial intelligence is bringing Dickens's characters to life through conversation. For instance, generative AI chatbots now let people talk with the digital Charles Dickens or his characters. Services like character.ai allow users to interact with historical figures. One writer recounts creating a free account at Character AI and chatting with a simulated Charles Dickens, who replied in character as if he were the Victorian author. The responses may only be approximations, but the effect is startlingly intimate. You can ask Dickens his favourite novel, and the AI Dickens answers in first person. In VR theatre, AI takes the form of interactive hosts or guided agents. In Agile Lenses, A Christmas Carol VR, the 2023 production introduced an AI-powered Dickens virtual house manager to read audiences before the show. So instead of a pre-recorded narrator, an AI character could speak about this holiday season's tradition, making each session feel personalised. These AI features deepen the thematic engagement. Consider Scrooge's own journey. In Dickens's tale, the ghosts speak with him directly, forcing him to confront death and regret. With AI and VR, we can be on the receiving end of that dialogue. Some VR shows let you actually converse with a ghostly guide, merging the old medium of theatre with new AI dialogue. Others simulate the uncanny intimacy of Victorian seances or letters from beyond the grave. Even without actors, AI chatbots create a form of digital seance, letting us pose questions. All of this heightened.
So sorry, we're having a little bit of background noise. Excuse me, we are experiencing a little bit of background noise. If we could mute, that would be wonderful.
The emotional impact when a virtual ghost of Christmas past answers you, or an AI Dickens pen pal responds to your questions. The Victorian fear of what comes after death becomes a personal interactive
Well, in
experience.
Spain. Oh shit.
All right, I'm going to try and work out how to adjust the sound.
Yeah. Have you? Actually. Yeah. Really? That's how you didn't have to. Sorry, let me just turn it on. You say that. Oh, if you insist.
By now, it's clear that VR and AI are more than mere novelties. They are reshaping how we think about death, ghosts, and Dickens. In Victorian times, people gazed at mediums, spiritualist seances, and Gothic tales to process mortality. Today, we experiment with digital afterlives. Researchers even warn of unwanted digital hauntings, as AI can simulate the dead. In a way, VR ghosts and AI chatbots are the spiritual successors to Victorian ghost stories. They let us confront Dickensian ideas of death with new eyes and ears, walking Victorian streets at midnight or hearing spectral whispers via a headset. What does this mean for Dickens's legacy? First, these projects introduce Dickens to people who might never pick up a 19th century novel. Someone tuning into a Thrive Pavilion VR play, or a student in a VR Dickensian workhouse, or a gamer trained chained, becomes curious. Who was this Dickens? The technology sparks renewed interest in his stories and the era they depict. Second, the thematic core of Dickens's work is preserved. By actively engaging with ghosts and death, audiences can experience the same emotional journey Scrooge had, from fear and remorse to empathy and redemption. In this way, high-tech hauntings amplify Dickens's message that even across centuries, confronting the spectre of our past selves can lead to personal transformation. So in short, these VR and AR experiences have conjured a bridge between Victorian and modern minds. The past century's ghostly tales now live in pixels and code, but they serve the same purpose: to make us reflect on humanity, mortality, and compassion. As one creator put it, combining VR and live theatre lets the audience see, converse with, and even touch the impossible, turning Dickens's philosophy of death into an immersive reality. By reimagining Dickens's spectral worlds with cutting-edge tech, innovators are ensuring that his stories remain alive, spooky, and relevant for generations to come. Thank you for joining this journey through Dickens's digital haunts.
Fantastic. All right. That was marvelous. Thank you all so much for sharing that. Yeah, that concludes the video sharing portion of this presentation. Um, Feel free to unmute yourselves. I'm going to stop recording so that we can just have a bit of a conversation.